Cells are the most basic unit of life. Each one is a building block for more complex systems that eventually make up you and every living organism on Earth. A cell has all the parts to bring in nutrients, remove waste, communicate, and to make copies of itself. But this was not always known until more recently. Today we'll learn about the discoveries that led to our understanding of the cell, and how today we think of the cell as being like a city of its own. Welcome to cell biology. Our understanding of cell theory today would not be made possible without the early discoveries from these 5 scientists. Robert Hooke is generally credited with making the first observations and drawings of a cell. He observed a piece of cork under his microscope and noticed that they were arranged in little blocks that reminded him of prison cells, so then he called them cells. Leeuwenhoek is often credited with improving the light microscope, allowing it to magnify even further so that we could observe cells and living organisms under a microscope. Next is Schleiden. Schleiden came up with the idea that all plants come from plants. Schwann proposed that all animals come from animals. And Virchow came up with the idea that all cells come from cells. I know that was a handful, and some of these names are a bit difficult, so I'll give you some mnemonic devices to help you remember these scientists and what they're often credited with. So I learned this from my 9th grade biology teacher, and so if you're watching out there, Mrs. Clausen, I'm just telling this to my class now. But it goes like this. Leeuwenhoek is credited with improving the microscope, so the name Leeuwenhoek and microscope are both 3-syllable words. Leeuwenhoek microscope. So that's how I remember that. Schwann came up with the idea that all animals come from animals. Well, a swan is an animal, so all swans come from swans. Next is Virchow, and he came up with the idea that all cells come from pre-existing cells, so you can remember it like all cows come from cows. It's silly, but hopefully it works for you. Those discoveries were important, and now with the aid of modern science, we understand that cells share 3 characteristics. One is that cells tend to be small and microscopic. 2, cells are enclosed in a semi-passable or permeable membrane, which allows them to bring nutrients in and let waste out. And 3rd, cells are all filled with cytoplasm, which is like cell goo or like cell flesh. It's this fluid that gives the cell its structure and its shape. Cells can be separated into 2 broad categories. You have prokaryotes, which are really basic, simple cells. These would include bacteria that don't have a nucleus and they don't have membrane-bound organelles. The other type is eukaryotic cells, and these are a little bit more complex, and these do have membrane-bound organelles and they do have a nucleus. If you broke down the Greek roots, you would have a better understanding between the difference of prokaryote and eukaryote. So the Greek root pro means first or before, and I take it to mean primitive or basic. The Greek root eu means good or well, but I take it to mean complex. And finally, you have karyon, which means kernel or nut in Greek. So you can put the words together and you can have an understanding between the difference of prokaryote and eukaryote. Let's start discussing cell organelles, or the parts that help a cell function. Now, for the rest of this video, I'll use an analogy that will help you understand cell organelles better, and that is, a cell is like a city of its own. And a city has its own department. It's got the police, it's got the fire department, it has schools, it's got highways and bridges, it has a town hall that makes decisions, and the cell is very much the same way. It's got a lot of little parts and pieces that help the cell operate on a day-to-day basis. The first cell organelle that we want to discuss is the cytoskeleton, and as the name suggests, it's kind of like your own skeleton, where your skeleton is designed to give you form, structure, support, as well as strength. And it's composed of 3 different types of threads or fibers, and these are the microfilaments, the intermediate filaments, and the microtubules. And these all hold up the cell and it gives it structure and shape and support. And if I were to go back to my city analogy, I would say that the cytoskeleton would be like roads, bridges, and highways. The nucleus is probably the most complex and important cell organelle. It's often compared to a city's town hall or government or control center because it provides the cells with instructions on how to grow and develop. So it's responsible for 2 main things, and that is to protect the DNA and then also to make the DNA readily available whenever the cell needs it to start making copies of itself or to start producing proteins. Structurally, the nucleus is surrounded by a double membrane known as a nuclear envelope, and this envelope has little holes and pores that allow large molecules to pass in and out of the nucleus. Furthermore, deep inside the nucleus, inside its core, is a structure called the nucleolus, and the nucleolus is responsible for making ribosomes, which you'll see later on. Ribosomes are responsible for making proteins. Bordering the nucleus is a cell organelle with thin folded membranes known as the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER for short. And there are two different types of ER. The first is the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and these are studded with ribosomes which help make proteins and lipids. The other type is known as smooth ER. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum don't have ribosomes on them, and instead they're responsible for detoxifying drugs and alcohol. Now, if you need an analogy, the endoplasmic reticulum is kind of like cities' factories or manufacturing plants, or in the case of smooth ER, it's kind of like a waste treatment facility. Ribosomes are found in the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or they're just suspended throughout the cytoplasm. They're composed mainly of RNA and protein, and they're the site of protein production and protein synthesis. They're very similar to the endoplasmic reticulum in that they're kind of like manufacturing plants that produce goods for the cell. They produce goods for the city. The Golgi apparatus is very much like the cell's post office in that it sorts and delivers proteins wherever the cell needs it. So the Golgi apparatus receives proteins from the endoplasmic reticulum, and then they'll store it there, or they'll fold the proteins in a specific way so that it works later on, and when it's ready to go, the Golgi apparatus will then send it out to different parts of the cell. So it's very much like UPS and the post office. It's like the FedEx in that it sorts and delivers proteins. Vesicles are like little transport vehicles or trucks that move goods and materials across the cells. They often don't last very long, and they have to be recycled and remade as needed. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's a bean-shaped organelle that produces energy through cellular respiration, where food, glucose, is converted into ATP, which the cell uses as energy. It's once thought that these mitochondria were freely living organisms, almost kind of like bacteria, that were taken in by eukaryotic cells, and now they have a mutual relationship where they can help each other survive. Depending on how you look at it, the lysosomes are kind of like the police, or the army, or the janitors of the cell. They are suicide sacs, and they contain enzymes or special chemicals that help recycle old cell parts, and they help defend the cell from bacteria. In animal cells, you'll find centrioles, which are a pair of cell organelle structures that shoot off these webs known as filaments, and it helps pull the cell apart, and it helps them divide during a process called mitosis. In an analogy, I would just say that centrioles are kind of like construction companies. It helps the cell build itself up. Centrioles also produce the filaments that make up the structure of an organelle called the flagella. The flagella is like a tail-like, whip-like structure that helps the cell move around. I want to discuss three organelles that are found mainly in plant cells. The first is the chloroplast, which is kind of like a solar power plant. It contains green pigment called chlorophyll, and this captures sunlight to produce food and energy. The next is the large central vacuole, and this is a place where the plant cells store materials. It stores enzymes and food and water. Last but not least, you have the cell wall, which is a rigid structure that surrounds the cell membrane. I think I'll stop here, and I'll call this Cell Biology Part 1. But before I take off, I'll provide you with a summary of what we just learned. I went into 5 scientists and their discoveries, which have helped us understand cell theory a little bit better nowadays. I also went into the analogy that the cell is kind of like a city of its own, in that it has its police department, it has its army, it has its factories and power plants, and we discuss each of the cell organelles. I just recommend that you look into other resources and you make notes and flashcards as you try to memorize what each cell organelle does. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Win Biology.